Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Viewpoint. I know you would be surprised to have me sit on the anchor seat on behalf of my colleague, Vanessa, who is unavoidably absent. I believe she would be joining us in the subsequent editions of the program. But all the same, because you are there, we can't not let the day go by. That is why today, in today's edition, we may have it out of the normal, as it is not always, having a guest and another person in the house. So today, we'll be discussing with someone out of the country, talking about issues related to the internet. We know the internet is something that none of us can struggle now to bypass. It is part and parcel of us. So we just have to talk about it. And in today's edition of the program, we'll be looking at internet-related issues, such as regulation of internet and control of content of the internet that we have. So we'll be talking to a senior university lecturer, Dr. Gideon Mbidzenye. Gideon is on the line to Sweden. Good evening, Doctor, and thank you for accepting our interview to talk with us today.
Good evening, Vanessa. Thank you a lot for inviting me, and it's a pleasure, as usual, to be with you today. Let me start first by expressing my sincere concerns and condolences to the challenges that are facing a lot of the people in the Northwest and Southwest regions, and hopefully things would get better as the days go by. Yes, as you mentioned, Mr. Venatius, the internet is one of those, has become one of those fundamental elements or fabrics of our society today. And yes, I totally agree with you. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to discuss my opinions about the internet with you.
Thank you, Doctor, for being there. We took the appointment the other time that you would be our resource person when it comes to internet-related issues. And today we'll maintain the format of the program. That is why we begin with the first part. Let us take the questions in part one. We begin part one of this edition with these questions. Doctor, I am with you. Should internet be regulated? If so, by who? If not, why? Your opinion?
Yes, this is a very good question, and this is not the first time this question is coming up, and it's as many other issues as you will understand with me, Mr. Mange Venatius. This is not a simple yes or a simple no. And why do I say so? It depends on what you mean by regulation. It depends on what you, and even if you want the internet to be regulated, it depends on how you do it. So do we want some form of control on the internet? Yes, for sure. We want it to be controlled. Then this answer will ultimately depend on how should this be done? Is this achievable, and by who?
Doctor, we take that yes for question one. We take over question two, which is, should anyone be accountable for internet content that we have?
Yes, again, and here there is a lot we can learn from if we look back in terms of information production and consumption, which is one of the oldest elements or core fabrics of the human society. Yes, there should be some responsibility for what is being produced, and there should be some responsibility for who is distributing it.
Thank you.
So, yes.
Doctor, these are the two questions that we will be talking for those number of minutes ahead of us. So we take the second part, which would be the discussion on these topics. If you are just joining us, you're watching Viewpoint here on DBS television, and we are discussing live with our correspondent or with our guest from Sweden. We are looking tonight on issues of internet regulation and our guest thinks that internet should be regulated. Doctor, what is your point of view? Internet should be regulated.
Exactly. Like I mentioned, internet should be regulated. And there are many ways we can look at this, Mr. Venatius. The first is that let's go back as far as maybe say, I don't know, several years behind, I would say hundreds of years. How did we produce and consume information? Well, we had maybe, let's say we are in a village setting. There was maybe a town crier who would get information from the authorities. And then that information would be disseminated to the villagers through several different forms as we know it. Eventually, with the written culture, we start to disseminate information through newspapers and books. This system would evolve to become maybe a radio-based system, and eventually to maybe a television and radio-based system as we have it today. So if you look at the internet in the light of that development, you can now understand where we are. At this point, it's not the new phenomenon in terms of producing and disseminating information. The real question is, how does these new possibilities of producing and disseminating information differ from the town crier who will go out and produce information that was given maybe by a quarterhead or by a king or by a chief? And if we look at it that way, then you can understand that we can at least agree that initially there has been a sort of asymmetric flow of information. On the one hand, you have the masses that would have to consume information. On the other hand, you have a few privileged in society that produce this information. With the advent of the internet, we have a different dynamic where we have as many producers as we have consumers. In this new power structure, there is a lot of different types of rules. There is the publisher. There is the person who makes it possible for information to be disseminated. There is even the actors that help to even disseminate that information further. So if you look at it in this light, you could begin to expect some level of responsibility from each actor based on their role. And with respect to the responsibility from each actor, then you can see there is a need for some sort of a reference standard. The internet itself is built on a reference standard, a reference way of doing things in order to maximize the value of the internet, so to say. So in that framework, I would discuss more of the type of reference frameworks that I'm talking about here. But yes, this should be there should be some sort of base or standard base for information circulation or production and consumption via the internet.
Doctor, we are talking about the internet, which is a tool that is available to millions of individuals, and we've witnessed cases of information circulating on social media, information that could be so sensitive that can cause the lives of many, the lives of a nation as a whole. We have the Anglophone crisis that is ongoing in the northwest and southwest regions in Cameroon back home, which you would believe with me that with the help of social media, with the help of the internet, the crisis has taken a proportion beyond understanding. And we are talking of ways to control the flow of this information, the flow of this, fake news that we have had in the social media. Doctor, I wanted to find out from you, who should do this control?
I think the first thing is not to forget that what you're saying, why I totally agree with you in terms of the fact that there is also a major problem with information that is possibly harming people, and this should not be the case. But I think you should try to not, let the tree protect you from seeing the forest, because what you should also know is that, let's take the example of other technologies. When we control the production of energy, such as electricity, using some technology, once in a while that technology would fail us and we would have issues because of that. We are able to produce energy in other developed countries very cheaply using nuclear technology, even though this is not a very sustainable way of producing energy. But still, the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a positive and a negative. And once when we try to look at the internet, we shouldn't also forget that we need to balance those unwanted effects with the wanted effects, and then we can be able to make the case for whether we should regulate and for how much we should regulate and who should do it. And looking at the second question that you're asking, should we regulate the internet? Obviously, there is a need for regulating the internet. If you can characterize the way the internet has developed so far, that it has, for the first, taken a lot of people, and I mean government and individuals as well, unaware. For the second, we have practiced several models where we try to control, or at least attempt to control, the contents. Some has been successful, some has been less successful. Now, to discuss about who should control the internet or who should regulate the internet, I think that question should also come with how should that even be done, if it's possible. If you think of the world or the countries in the world as separate entities with some sort of you say independence, where each country set up their rules, geopolitical structures that govern the country, then you can begin to ask yourself the question of how are these countries similar with respect to the set of rules that are in place? And of course, the answer is that there is as many differences as there are countries. So each country, what is allowed in each country is not allowed in another country. So the laws and the regulations within one country do not necessarily agree with the regulations with another country. One first challenge with the internet is that it transcends these national boundaries. Because it transcends these national boundaries, then the first question you would ask is, should politicians be allowed to regulate? And if they are, according to which country's standard? Which country's standard is right and which country's standard is wrong? Maybe that makes it difficult to think of it in that way. Should we then allow the providers, the service providers to regulate? If they should regulate, which country's laws should they follow? So there is an issue as well with respect to how should this be achieved. And of course, over time, there has been various approaches to actually try to regulate the internet. And in the US, I probably think you've heard of Section 230 that has been talked about quite a lot lately, which basically says that if I am an internet service provider, I'm protected from the contents of what is being produced on the internet on my service, or how the content is being distributed. In other words, I cannot be held responsible for any information is provided on the internet, on a service or on a platform that I've made available as an internet service provider. Of course, I cannot be held responsible for that kind of content, because there are two sides to it. The one side is that if you start to hold internet service providers accountable or responsible for the content of what they produce, the immediate effect of that could be that they would then maybe have to put some filters, which would then have to control such that the only information that is allowed would be what they think that cannot make them liable, or that at least is safe from their own point of view. Ultimately, what will happen is that you would have a very strong censorship of what should be on the internet. For many people, that would mark the end of the internet as we know it, because innovation and every other thing else would become difficult. And if this internet service provider is going to filter information, he would need to put in some filters. How would those filters be implemented depending on even where they are within the same country? So as you can see, it becomes a very complex problem. Compare this now with, for example, book publishing. publishers facilitate the production of a book? Should publishers be held accountable for the content of the book? Or should the authors be held accountable for the content of the book? This is the same kind of a situation that we are. If you compare this to the initial analogy that I made, there is a set of people that produce information and a set of people that consumes the information. For the internet, we find ourselves in a many-to-many relationship. Obviously, that makes the aspect of regulation very difficult. This is compared to previous information models, which are like few journalists or few writers or few authorities produce information, and the rest of the society consumes that information. So that is a very big challenge, and a discussion that is actually still ongoing, both in Europe, in Asia, and in the US, where they have tried several different models or ongoing trials actually on how to control the contents of the internet.
Thank you, Doctor. We from what you are saying, we are getting that if we have to take the control of this internet, left it in the hands of politicians, it would be a bit complicated because different countries have different laws, and to control them, which law are we going to use? And if you take the internet provider, the service provider, those in charge of these platforms, they go beyond various territorial boundaries. So which territory, which laws pertaining to which countries would be used in controlling the content of the internet? And we will take the individual who produce the content that we have on the internet. Doctor, we understand that when we talk about the content of the internet, manipulation of the content, that is just basically the function of journalists. And you remember, journalists, these are those who have the information, treat the information. That is what makes them different from any other internet user, the treatment that we give to the information that we have. But in our social media, you would realize that hate speech has been one of the the factors that has been fueling all forms of division, fueling all forms of war, perhaps across continents, across countries, across individuals, across tribes. So in this case, what about the person producing the content? Can he, because you made an analogy of the author and the publisher. Now, the author in this case is the person producing the information. Can he, is there any way that we can talk to them to be able to control, to kind of regulate, the information they send out for consumption in the social media?
That's a very good way of thinking about it, but I would look at it from three perspectives. The first one is, as you say, the provider of the information. Already at that point, there is a major conflicting issue that you have to deal with. There is freedom of speech. Many countries talk about that. I have the freedom to say whatever I want. Well, that freedom might be limited when what you say start to harm somebody. Now, we have to separate that production from the distribution process. That you have the freedom to say what you want gives you the freedom to spread what you want. Freedom of spread, as they call it. That is something separate. While people might have their freedom of speeches, while people might have the freedom to say whatever they want, we should not, and this is possibly maybe what I would come back to this, where the control point of the internet today is. We should not give them, I think, in my opinion, the freedom of spreading something that could ultimately harm somebody. Now, the second part of it is, as you say, the people that, or at least the platform provider, the service provider, what mechanisms are there today that we are seeing that are aiming at providing some sort of control of that information? The base model that applies to US and to Japan and to Europe is mainly that if the producer of something, if I produce something that is considered in any way harmful, then the provider is not liable, but as soon as they are notified about something, either by a user in Europe. If you put something on the internet and I realize that is harmful to me, then I would notify the provider, and the provider is obliged to remove it. Now, the difference is that in the US, there is a procedure that the original author can get that information back by going to the provider and proving that this information is not harmful or something. Now, in Japan, they follow a different model where if you put something on the internet and then I realize that it could harm me, I notify the provider. The provider would then notify you, the original author, and then if you do not react to that before they can put that information down. So the provider gives you, the original author, the opportunity to rectify the content or the quality of the information. In Europe, there isn't this feedback loop, whereas in Europe, you are expected to remove the information without necessarily the original author, or at least the provider is expected to remove the information without hearing from the original author. The real problem there is then that it's possible that credible information without anything wrong with it, just because of the way the procedure is laid out, it's very easy to force the provider to pull down credible information without a mechanism for returning that information back on the internet. So yes, that's the second layer of control. The first layer of control is that we should observe freedom of speech, and there should not be, or we shouldn't interpret freedom of speech or freedom of opinion as the same thing as freedom of spreading. Now, the third layer, which I think is more futuristic, is that the internet is capable in some ways of self-regulating. Although this in general can be perceived as a major difference in terms of most of the technologies between Europe and the US. In the US, there's the approach of self-regulating system, whereas in Europe, we have a top-down approach. But the self-regulating part of the internet is very simple to see. But I think it's a question for the technology, and I think eventually we will get there, where the information can be self-verifying. And this has been proven with the so-called cryptocurrencies. We don't have any specific major players that regulate cryptocurrencies, but the infrastructure is in such a way that cheating is very difficult. So this is, we could see the same kind of ledger solutions, distributed solutions, where it can be very difficult to change the content of information. In that case, it's possible to self-regulate certain things in the internet, just like we see with cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, for example. So yes, in my opinion, who should regulate it? As you can see from the individual, we have to respect individual freedoms. On the level of the government and say co-regulation between government and private enterprises in terms of trying to filter information, but not doing it in a way that would amount to full censorship. If something is harmful, we can verify that it's harmful. I think that's what we are seeing today. But I think in the future, we might have self-regulatory schemes similar to what we see today in cryptocurrency.
Thank you, Doctor. From what we are coming out with, there are three key players involved when we talk about the internet. We have the government, we have the service providers, and then we have the individual producing the content. Now, putting these together, Doctor, we take the second question, which is, should anyone be accountable for the content that we have on our internet? And Doctor, there should be some accountability on the content. That is your view.
Exactly, that's my view, and that for me, we can again borrow from the basic model of writing a book. I write a very nice book. I take it to a publisher. The publisher looks at the book, he calculates the cost of producing the book, and then I pay some money and the book is produced. Of course, intellectual property rights says that the material in my book, in the book, is mine. The only person who is allowed to reproduce it is the publisher, with some agreed terms of or conditions with me. Now, the question here, we should look to make it very simple. If somebody read that book and committed suicide or did something terrible, and which is also the case with books. I mean, there are books that are also controversial. Who is responsible? Is it the person who read the book? Is it the writer of the book? Or is it the publisher of the book? And I think it's not an obvious answer. Maybe each one of these people have some responsibility. Should you expect a publisher to read, understand, and agree with the content of all books before they publish it? On the other hand, as an individual, should I read and believe everything that I see? And of course, as a writer, should you write things and do not expect that there are consequences? We've seen lately examples that words have a lot of consequences. This is unfortunately some of the things that many people do not see. They just think, oh yes, I just said this, or maybe I put this on the internet, and so what? Yes, well, it has consequences because human beings would interpret the information there and they will take it, react to it in different ways. So if you transfer that analogy to the internet, then you have to have some shared responsibility as to who produces what they're producing, the original author, and this doesn't necessarily have to be negative. The positive part of it, this is music and even film production. Musicians produce a song, they expect to get some income or to get some financing from people enjoying their song. Now the song ends up in the internet and everybody have access to it for free. And there the question is then who should, is that good or bad? There's some level of responsibility for the person who is distributing it and the person who is also consuming it.
For time constraint, we have to cut short our discussion at this very moment. Doctor, in less than a minute, if you were to talk to internet users, especially those back home, perhaps in Africa, where the control mechanism is that loose, in less than a minute, in 30 seconds, what would you tell them?
Well, the simple thing about the internet will be that do not act on the internet as if you're invisible. If all of us were thinking that way, we would reduce the amount of what we may classify as misinformation on the internet. The problem is people think they're invisible, but you are not.
For being there, do not act on the internet as if you were invisible. That would be our take-home message for tonight's edition of Viewpoint. While hoping that when we knock at your door, Doctor, you would be available. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's edition of Viewpoint. Programs continue here on DBS television. Immediately after this, it would be the primetime news with Cynthia Nguemo. Tomorrow would certainly be another day. Until then, goodbye.